from Group 1, and now we will be presenting our final project on industrial statistic experiment titled The Analysis of the Factors Affecting the Time Taken to Fry an Egg. Next slide. So our group members consist of 5, which are myself, Salsabila Putri Maharani, Shandrina, Aliyya, Marmara, Mellin, Hasna, Nurfadhila, Muhammad Kelvin, Ruliandy, and Lukas Josua. So first and foremost, about our experiment, we're doing an experiment to analyze the time taken to perfectly fry an egg on a stove using cooking oil based on the factors affecting. The aim of our experiment is to find the combination of factors level that take the least time to fry an egg. The tests are carried out to determine the times produced by each combination of experiment and to observe the effect of each of the existing factors. A systematic experiment will be done to achieve that aim, specifically design of experiment. The analysis of variance test will also be used to evaluate the research hypothesis. Next slide. This is our presentation outline. And moving on to the overviews, firstly, the design of experiment overview. So design of experiment is a statistical technique for planning, executing, analyzing, and interpreting controlled tests in order to examine the numerous input elements that influence the outcome. It can also be used to check for possible input or output relationship and build a predictive equation for future what-if scenarios. And for our activities in this practicum, our group tested the effect of the amount of oil, level of heat, and types of pan used on the time takes to perfectly cook an egg on a stove. Next slide.
For our problem identification, we need to find out, does the practical data fulfill the ANOVA assumption? Which factor has the most influence in the overall result? Is there any interaction occurred between the given factors? For the experiment objective, the first one, we need to learn how the given factors will affect the time needed to fry an egg. Second, we need to know whether the experiment will fulfill the predefined ANOVA assumption. Third, we need to know which factor has the most significant impact on the result. And the last one, we need to know if there any interaction occurred between the given factors. Next. In the next part, we have design of experiment. The purposeful design of the process of an experiment, such like minimize the risk of outside interference and that's a much more accurate result. The basic theory has 3 parts: randomization, replication, and blocking. ANOVA, or analysis of variance, is probably the most widely used statistical method for hypothesis. In the statistical analysis was used to test the result of multiple treatment procedures and compares the result. ANOVA comes in 2 analysis methods, one-way method and two-way method. Next, the factorial design. The factorial design are a form of true experiment where multiple factors are manipulated or allowed to vary that is included, an experiment which by design has multiple factors.
Next, we're going to discuss about method. The data was collected by using a uniform method of cooking the eggs. Frying was taken at the point in which bubble broke, then reaching the surface of the cooking oil. After proper cooking, we stopped the timer when the egg yolk got hardened. Our experiment is conducted with one subject of experimentation with an interval of min and max firepower with 2 repetitions of each gap with a different effort level of the type of pan and amount of oil. These results suggest that we can efficiently use gas and oil for cooking by experimenting based on the strength of the fire, the type of the pan, and the amount of oil used. For the tools and materials we use for this practicum, there are 16 eggs, 30 and 250 ml cooking oil, gas stove, frying pan, and ceramic non-sticky fry pan. The response of variable for this practicum is the time, unit is in seconds, needed to fry an egg on a stove. Then for the factors, we have amount of cooking, level of heat, and types of pan. And then the levels, we have 30 ml of oil, 250 ml of oil, low heat, high heat, flat frying pan, and wok or stir frying pan. Lastly, we have 2 replication for this experiment. Here is the data that we collect using the help of Minitab. The picture on the slide is the summary of all model adequacy checking. Residuals that have a normal distribution, similar residuals, and independent residuals are needed when using the factorial design approach. The general factorial regression yielded plot of the residuals. In this experiment, it generated 4 graphs, a normal probability plot, a versus histogram of the residuals, and a versus order. In the normal probability test graph, it can be seen in the data that which we have collected relatively follows the line. With the Kolmogorov normality test, the p-value is bigger than 0.05. So, the decision was taken to fail to reject null hypothesis. Therefore, the residual data is normally distributed.
So next is independence assumption. It can be identified visually that there is no certain pattern in the versus order graph that indicates a dependency on the resultant data after the previous result data. It means that the residual data is not influenced by the order of observations made previously, or we can conclude that the residual data is independent. Next. So the next assumption is homogeneity assumption. As shown on the slide, it can be concluded that the data obtained are homogeneous because the plot spread evenly above and below the zero axis without forming a certain pattern. Therefore, the ANOVA assumption, namely the homogeneity of variance, has been fulfilled. Next is equal variance. By using a significant level of 0.05 and compared with a p-value of the data, which is 0.976, the decision to fail to reject the null hypothesis was obtained, so that it can be decided that the residual data is homogeneous. So the next part is model interpretation. For the first model is interaction plot. From this experiment, there are an interaction between oil and fire, oil and the type of pan, as well as the fire and the type of pan, because it shows that there are non-parallel lines on the graph. Among all interactions, the most significant interaction is between oil and the type of pan because it shows the line that intersects between these two factors on the graph. Next.
For the main effect plot for result, as we can see on the graph, the factor of oil, fire, and type of pan have an effect on the result, but there are differences in slope between these three factors. The greater the slope of line, the greater the effect. The fire factor is factor that has the greatest significant effect on the result indicated by steepest slope line. For Pareto chart, this display which factors are most influential to the least. The most relevant aspect of a factor affecting the time taken to fry an egg start with the fire, pan, and oil. In our experiment elements, the most influential factor passed the standardized effect value of this experiment, which is 2.365. Next. There are two factors that have a p-value smaller than 0.05, indicating that they have a significant influence on the response, namely the fire and type of pan. In two-way interaction, the interaction between the amount of oil and fire, amount of oil and type of pan, and three-way interaction also had insignificant effect with p-value smaller than 0.05. Meanwhile, the amount of oil also have interaction between the fire and type of pan have a p-value greater than 0.05, which indicates the related factor do not affect each other. From all previous explanation, we can finally answer the state problem identification, which we conclude to 2 points. First, the data are considered normal, homogeneous, and independent based on our experiment, which means they fulfill the ANOVA assumption. According to the p-value and Pareto chart, the most relevant aspect to the X start with fire, pan, and oil. It shows that the strength of fire has bigger effect, respective effect in the experiment. And third, there are interaction between the factor. From the result, we can see that all the factor and interaction provide a repercussion, significant interaction like between oil and the type of pan because it shows the line intersects between these two factors. Next. These are our reference, and next, our appendix of our experiment. And I think that's all from us. Thank you for your attention.